in the book of Acts tonight. We're just going to be continuing to look as we've kind of built off the Easter story. And we're going to be looking tonight about what happened to the disciples, specifically with Peter. What happened to them after Jesus reappeared to them and then after they saw Jesus ascend. So that's what we talked about last week. So Jesus came and he lived and he was crucified and he was put in the tomb and then he resurrected. And then when they found the tomb was empty, he appeared to the disciples several times after that. And then remember there at the end, we talked about how he appeared to the disciples the last time when he gave them the Great Commission. And then they watched as he ascended back to heaven to be with the Father, and then that he would return. Remember, the angels were there and they said that he would return. And so then the disciples were kind of standing there and they're just like, okay, what now? And so what we've kind of been talking about is the transformation that took place in the disciples after all this happened. Because, you can imagine they'd be quite shooketh after witnessing all of this and after seeing all of these things going on, witnessing the things that they had witnessed was life-changing stuff. And that's what we're focused on. That's what we're talking about, right? Is we're talking about this life-changing stuff. But in the midst of this life-changing stuff, it's important for us to understand that they were probably still a little afraid. They were probably confused. They thought that he had been defeated, and then they found out that he was victorious, but then they found out that he wasn't really going to quote unquote win until years later when he came back again. And they've been given this commission to go into all the world and tell people about Jesus and baptize people. And so there's like all these things going on, right? Like, I'm sure some of them kind of thought like, are we crazy? Like, did what we just see really happen? They were confused. They weren't really sure kind of what to think of it all or what to take from it. But God had given them a very clear command, and that was for them to go and tell people about Jesus. That was for them to go start churches and baptize. And so that's what we're kind of going to be talking about tonight. And so it reminds me of this story. Speaking of fear, I think it's fair for us to say that maybe some of us, at least, I know I'm a big fraidy cat, that some of us have been scared at times in our lives. And so I'm reminded of this story of a cab driver, and he's driving this gentleman, and they're cruising down the road, and the gentleman leans over to the cab driver, and he taps him on the shoulder. And the cab driver screams, and he jerks the wheel, and he jumps the curb, and he takes out a pole, and he slams on the brakes, and he stops right in front of this big window. And you can think for a second, they're all just sitting there, and they're both just sitting there in silence, and they're just like, their hearts are like racing like 100 miles a minute. And they're just like, are you okay? And the cab driver is kind of shaking, and the passenger's kind of shaking. And the cab driver's like, I'm so sorry. He's like, this is my first day as a cab driver. He's like, it's not your fault. And the guy in the back seat's like, man, I'm sorry. I wouldn't have tapped you on the shoulder if I would have known that I was going to scare you. And he's like, well, you just have to understand, this is my first day as a taxi cab driver. I used to drive Hershey's for a living. Hershey, yeah. So if someone would have tapped him on the shoulder, they would have been dead. It's not funny if I have to explain it to you guys. My gosh. Anyway. Thanks, Jeremy. So anyway, so I want to start off by talking about the day of Pentecost, okay? And we hear about this a lot. The day of Pentecost, which we're about to read about it, so I won't tell you too much about it. But this was a celebration. This would have been exactly 50 days after the Passover. And so we know then that this is, about 50 days after Jesus would have died. And so we have the disciples. They're gathered in a place. And so we're in Acts chapter 2. Starting in verse 1, and this is what it says. It says, when the day of Pentecost arrived, they were all together in one place. Suddenly there came from heaven a sound like a mighty rushing wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. And divided tongues as of fire appeared to them and rested on each one of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. Okay, so the tongues thing, we're actually not going to talk about too much tonight. The thing I want us to look at is this Spirit of God that comes upon them on the day of Pentecost. So there's a couple of things that we need to remember about Peter. I mentioned this several weeks ago, but it's possible that maybe you guys have forgotten, or some of you weren't here. So let me just kind of remind you of a few things. First off, we have to understand that Peter was a fisherman. Okay. Now you may be sitting there like, bro, I like to go fishing. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. Like, I'm not saying anything bad about going fishing. I'm not saying anything bad about fishermen. But at that time, fishermen were typically unskilled and uneducated. Like, that's what they did for a living. They were usually very rough and kind of gruff. And so it wasn't like people who had read a lot of books and gone to school were like, oh, I think thou shalt becometh a fisherman. Like, that's not the way that it worked. Like, fishermen were typically like, I don't really want to live with my mom anymore, so I'm going to go beep, 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 be a fisherman. You know, like, that's just kind of how it went.
So whenever they were, instead of their mom threatening for them to have to get a job at McDonald's, they'd have to threaten to get a job as a fisherman.
Yes, that's exactly right. Fisherman was the old McDonald's. That's what I'm saying. Okay, we're done. Let's go home, everybody. Let's bow our heads. No, I'm just kidding. So anyway, Peter was a fisherman, okay? The other thing we need to remember, or one of the other things we need to remember about Peter, is that Peter lacked faith at times. Peter lacked faith at times. So remember, there's the example of, Jesus was out on the water, right? And the disciples were out and they were fishing and they saw Jesus and they were like, oh, a ghost. And they were kind of rattled and everything. And Jesus told Peter, he's like, hey, come out on the water with me. And remember, Peter started walking out on the water, but then the water started getting rough and choppy. And then what ended up happening? He got scared and he started, like there was something inside of him. He was afraid. He was very nervous, right? And so he got this sinking feeling. Sir, sinking feeling? Because he started sinking in the water. My gosh, man. Like, I feel like I'm on a roll tonight. You guys are just not getting any of these jokes. That's why I need a studio drummer that's just going to give me a rim shot whenever I do sing. Anyway, but the thing I want you to understand is that Peter lacked faith at times. So he was a fisherman. He lacked faith. You know, so often we think that people that God is going to use have to be perfect. They have to go to seminary. They have to be educated. They have to be really good at speaking to other people. They have to be really great at telling jokes just like me, right? Whatever. But anyway, but no, for real, but he wasn't. Remember the other thing, and this is probably one of the biggest things. Peter denied Jesus 3 times on the night of his arrest. Remember? Peter, they kept saying, hey, aren't you one of his? And he's like, no, I don't know him. And they're like, yeah, but you talk like him. And he's like, no, I thought I saw you with him. And he's like, no, that wasn't me, remember? And then Jesus looked at him and the rooster crowed and he felt guilty, right? Because he was afraid. And I don't think there's anything wrong with admitting that Peter was afraid. I don't think there's anything wrong with being afraid, even if you're afraid today at times. But we just need to understand that God can work with us. God can meet us. God can join us in that fear. And this is the thing, right? Like, we feel it sometimes. It can be crippling, right? Like, our anxiety can be so high and it can be so disabling and debilitating sometimes that, like, it's hard for us to do things. It's hard for us to carry on. It's hard for us to take a step in faith. It's hard for us to do something that we maybe don't really want to do. And you have to remember that Peter is feeling like defeat. He's feeling like the world's kind of crumbling around him. Like, he's very just deflated. And like, not only that, but Jesus told him he was going to deny him. And he's like, no, I'm never going to deny you. I'll die with you. But then he has this realization that, like, I did exactly what Jesus said I was going to do. Like, Jesus said that I was going to deny him. And that's exactly what I did. So Peter's living with all of this. And so, like I said, I'm sure a lot of us can relate in some ways. But the other thing we have to understand, and this is what we're going to talk about tonight, was that a lot can change in 50 days. And that's what happened with Peter. Like, a lot changed in the 50 days from when Jesus was crucified to where we are here at the day of Pentecost. And so we need to understand this also thing. Remember, it talked about this sound like a rushing wind, and then there was this fire, right? And so we have to understand that the presence of fire represents or symbolizes the presence of God. Remember Moses with the burning bush. Remember, like, Moses was on the mountain, and the bush went up in flames, and he's like, and then God started speaking to him through the bush. Remember, when God made the promise with Jacob, remember there was the torch that passed through the carcass, and that was the signature of God saying that he would fulfill his end of the obligation they had. So this object of fire, this flame, is a representation of God. And so when the fire comes upon these individuals and comes upon their tongues, it's God empowering them through his Spirit. That's what it is. And so here's the other thing, though. You have to understand that they needed to see that symbolic fire, because if they didn't, they would have no clue what was going on. They would have no idea what just happened to them. Like, they would just be sitting there like, okay, I think something just changed. Like, I feel like something just happened, but I'm not, bro, you like, are you feeling different? Like, I'm feeling like, but when they all saw this, they were like, yeah, things just got real. Things just, this is a game changer. Things just got different for us. And so, like I said, he was a different man. And so if we jump over to Acts chapter 4, and we start in verse 13, this is kind of a longer passage. I'll try to read through it as quick as I can and keep it interesting. Acts chapter 4, starting in verse 13, this is what it says. Now, when they saw the boldness of Peter and John, let's just stop and talk about this for a second. The same guy who started sinking in the water, the same guy who denied Jesus 3 times. Now, all of a sudden, Luke is writing here in the book of Acts about Peter's boldness. Now, when they saw the boldness of Peter and John and perceived that they were uneducated common men, they were astonished. Now, this is the Sanhedrin. This is the Jewish governing body, okay? So you had the Roman government who was kind of over everybody, and then you had kind of the Jewish high council that was over just the Jewish people, but they reported to the Roman government, but the Roman government kind of still let them have some power and authority over their own people. So the Jewish government couldn't rule Roman citizens, but the Jewish government could rule over their own Jewish citizens under the umbrella of Rome. Does that make sense? Lorelai, you look like you have a question. Okay, let me keep explaining. Maybe it'll make more sense. So the Jews are upset because, remember, Jesus was proclaiming to be the Messiah. People were chanting that Jesus was the Messiah. And so the Jewish council didn't believe that Jesus was really the Messiah. And so the Jewish council is like, we need this guy gone. This guy needs to be dead. We need to get rid of him, because if not, we're going to have a revolt on our hands. We're going to have a war with Rome. And then Rome isn't going to let us live in the palace anymore. Rome's not going to let us sit at the big boy table anymore. There's going to be a war between the Jews and the Romans. And guess what? The Roman government is so big, we're going to lose. And so the Jews denounced Jesus, they crucified Jesus, they killed Jesus as a way to keep the peace between them and Rome. And so that's what they were kind of, that's what they were looking at doing here. That's kind of what their thing was. So now here's Peter and John preaching with boldness, and they perceived that they were uneducated common men, like we talked about, but seeing the man who was healed. So there was a man with leprosy that was healed, that they healed. The Jewish council is kind of like, man, we can't deny this. They had nothing to say in opposition. But when they had commanded them to leave the council, they conferred with one another. So they kind of sent them out of the room, and they're like, okay, let's talk about what do we do about these guys? What shall we do with these men? For what a notable sign has been performed through them is evident to all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and we cannot deny it. But in order that it may spread no further among the people, let us warn them to speak no more to anyone in this name. So they called them and they charged them not to speak or teach at all in the name of Jesus. But Peter and John answered them, whether it's right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than to God, you must judge. For we cannot but speak of what we have seen and what we have heard. And when they had further threatened them, they let them go, finding no way to punish them because of the people, for all were praising God for what had happened. So what you have to understand here is the Sanhedrin wanted Peter and John to stop. They're like, you have to stop talking about Jesus. And they're like, we'd rather answer to God than answer to you, basically. So think about this. This is the same guy who a little servant girl said, you talk like Jesus. I saw you with Jesus. And he's like, no. Shh, get quiet. You know, like, you ever done that? Like, you smack your little sister and you're like, shh, no, quiet. Don't tell anybody. He was afraid of a little girl. Let's talk about this for a second. He was afraid of a little girl. And now here he is talking to a governing body that has the authority to kill him. And he's like, man, you go ahead and judge me. If you think that I should listen to you instead of God, you go ahead and judge me. You do that. I'm going to answer to God, though. So he's basically like, you do what you got to do. I'm going to follow God. That's what I'm going to do. That's what's important to me. That's what's most important. And so the Sanhedrin kind of look at each other and they're like, okay, they kind of called our bluff. There's nothing, they haven't really done anything wrong. There's really nothing we can do. Like, they called our bluff. We tried to get them to stop. They told us they're not going to stop. We got to let them go. And so that's kind of what happened. They're like, okay, well, Now you got to go. And the Sanhedrin were upset because not only were they preaching about Jesus, but the way that they were preaching about Jesus made the Jews and people that were listening think these guys killed the Messiah. These guys killed our Savior. These guys killed the one who was promising to bring us hope, the one who was promising to change our lives, the one who was promising to save us. And so the Sanhedrin are like, man, you guys are making us look bad. Like, we got to stop this. We got to put an end to it. We got to get you to stop spreading this bad stuff about us. But they couldn't stop them from talking. And so there's another thing I want for us to take from this, and I think it's interesting that Peter and John allude to this and that Luke writes about it, is that they made it very clear that they were obeying God. Now, understand, the Bible tells us we're supposed to obey our parents. The Bible tells us that we're supposed to obey the government, render to Caesar what is Caesar's and that sort of thing. Like, we have to understand, like, the Bible tells us very clearly that we're supposed to be obedient. But I think it's very clear here that God desires for us to be obedient to him when it conflicts with what the world is telling us. When the world is telling us, this is what you're supposed to do, but God is telling you this is what you're supposed to do. God is saying you should be obedient to me, not to the world. And that's what Peter's saying. Peter's like, if it costs me to die, then I'll die, but I'm going to obey God if you're trying to tell me not to obey God. Because God is going to come first, not the Roman government, not the Jewish high council, not the church. God is going to come first, and I'm going to obey him above all other things. And if that means that I die, then I'm okay with dying at that point. So this is a guy who is not afraid anymore. He's no longer afraid. He's not shaking in his boots. He's not living fearfully. He's not keeping things a secret anymore. He's now going into places and proclaiming Jesus, telling people. That's what he said. He's like, you can't get me to stop from saying, I know what I've seen, I know what I've heard, and you can't stop me from telling other people what I've seen and what I've heard, because what I've seen and what I've heard is going to change lives. It's a difference maker, something different. And the people needed to hear about it. And the other thing I want for us to understand about this before we jump on to the next part is that the Sanhedrin let them go, not because they didn't do anything wrong, but because God commanded them to let his people go. Because the thing is, God wasn't finished with Peter. God wasn't finished with John. And so even though the Sanhedrin thought they were letting them go because they didn't really have any reason to keep them, really they were letting them go because God wasn't through using them yet. And so they think they're coming up with these thoughts on their own, but really it's God who's using them to allow for his people to go out, because this is the start of the very first church. Like, after this, we're going to see thousands upon thousands of people being baptized and thousands upon thousands of people coming to be part of this first church and this first community in Antioch. And it's a powerful, life-changing time for so many people. And Peter, remember, that's what God said. Your name should be Petros. Petros meant the rock that I will build my church upon. That's why Peter had to be there. Peter had to be there because God had called him. Jesus had told him, you're going to be the rock upon which I build my church. So I need you, Peter. And not only did God need Peter alive, God needed Peter to be living. Do you get what I'm saying? Like, God needed Peter to be going out into the world and not hiding in his closet, not being afraid, not saying, no, I didn't see Jesus after he died. Like, he needed him going out and being bold and faithful, because that's what the church was going to be built upon. Those first disciples had to be powerful. They had to go out and not be afraid. They had to tell people what they had witnessed and what they saw. And if you think about this for a second from an apologetic standpoint, that's the reason why the disciples wrote these pages, that God used them to write the New Testament, to write what they saw, to write the word. And there is no evidence of a secular author saying that this stuff was bogus or proving these things wrong. A lot of scientists have come up with fancy theories, and there's plenty of people who say I know this and I know that, but there is no written evidence. There is no physical proof that goes against what this says. The evidence that supports what the New Testament says is overwhelmingly more powerful than any theory that some scientist who thinks he's smarter than other people can come up with. And that's just fact. That's truth. And so when you're looking at this, you have to understand that this is God working through these people like to fulfill these hundreds and thousands of year old prophecies to carry out his plan. And here's the other thing that I'll kind of tack onto that. Just because it doesn't make sense to you, or just because it doesn't go the way that you want it to go, doesn't change the truth of it. Doesn't take away from who he is. And I think that's what we get caught up in sometimes. It's like, well, if I was God, that's not what I would do. That's why we're not God. And that's why God is not human. God doesn't have the same human roots and connections and thoughts and emotions that we have. Doesn't mean that he's without love. Doesn't mean that he's without those things. Just means that those aren't the things that guide him in setting the world into motion. And this is a guy who's experienced a lot of hurt and tragedy and loss and suffering and pain in my life. Like, I'm not just sitting up here just like, woo, it's all been roses and unicorns and angels and cupcakes. Like, that's not what I'm saying at all. But what I'm saying at all is because of my faith, I'm able to accept those things that don't go my way. And I don't try to change God just because he's not my genie who grants my every wish. And again, I'm not saying that easily. This is something that's taken me 42 years to come up with. This is a realization that I've had to be in the Word and come to over hours and days and years of prayer and reading and interpretation and thought. Moving on. So the last thing I want to talk about here is, again, this speaking with boldness. And that's why I'm able to do these things, is because of the example that Peter was, because of the example that John was and the disciples were. Acts chapter 4, verse 29, it says, "And now, Lord, look upon their threats and grant to your servants to continue to speak your word with boldness." And so here they are again, like, God, make us bold. And I think it's interesting that they use the term continue to speak with boldness, because really until chapter 4, we don't really see them speaking with boldness. Before that, they were just kind of like, we don't want the wrong person to hear us. We might get in trouble, might get arrested. We might get in trouble. We might get killed. And so now all of a sudden it's saying continue to speak with boldness. And I don't feel like that's really what they would do. But the thing is, here it's saying, Lord, look upon us. And I think that's what we have to remember, is that the Lord is looking upon us. The Lord is looking upon his children. The Lord is looking upon his servants. And I think sometimes Satan allows for us to believe this lie that he's not looking upon us, or he doesn't care, or he turns his back on us, or he forsakes us, or he gives up on us, or whatever it is, that lie that Satan makes us believe is not true. And in that, we come up with this false ideology of who God is, and we can't allow for that to happen. Like, that cannot be our understanding of who God is. And so again, like, God is watching over them. God is using his servants. Like, God is maneuvering them. And so we're going to see here in a few chapters that Peter is going to be arrested. James has already been killed, we read about. But if we jump over to Acts chapter 12, we actually see that Peter is in jail. It's the night of his execution. Have you guys ever thought, I mean, probably not, this is probably one of those sick Robert thoughts that nobody really thinks about, but have you ever thought about, like, I don't know, like, you know how death row inmates get like a last meal? Like, you ever thought about, like, what would my last meal be? Or what would I do if the machine works? What would I do? Do what? Yeah, it probably doesn't. That's the death penalty right there. The ice cream machine doesn't work. Yeah. Or like how, you know, that was one of those, that's like one of those, when you're with your friends, like I said, you guys may not be this creepy, but like I've had this conversation with my friends, like, would you want to know when you were going to die? And if you knew you were going to die, what would you do with that last day? What would you do with your final hours? Like, this is the kind of stuff that Robert and his friends have talked about over the years. And so this is what I think is interesting. Everybody look up at Acts chapter 12. starting in verse 6. Check this out. Now, when Herod was about to bring him out on that very night, what was Peter doing? Sleeping. Peter's about to be executed, and he's sleeping. And listen, he's not just sleeping. He's sleeping between two soldiers bound with two chains, and sentries before the door were guarding the prison. And behold, an angel of the Lord stood next to him, and a light shone in the cell. And Peter still doesn't wake up. He struck Peter on the side and woke him, saying, "Get up quickly." And the chains fell off his hands. So this is what I want you to understand. This is a whole other level of sleeping. Peter's not just asleep. Like a bright light shines in the room, like, oh, and you would think, like, have your parents ever walked into the room and flipped on the light switch and you're like, oh, turn it off. Peter is not awoken by the light. The angel comes in like this. We're not talking about just like a little light. You know, we're talking about a bright light filling the room. And so the angel shows up and the harp is like, that's a horrible harp. But anyway, the harp plays and the light fills up and the angel looks at Peter. Peter's still asleep. So I saw y'all doing that. He kind of kicks he kind of kicks Peter a little bit, pokes him. He's like, boy, get up. Get up. Now, here's the deal. Again, I'm almost done. Again, imagine this is the night that Peter is going to die. And he's in a deep sleep. Now, I don't know about y'all, but I couldn't do that. Not only could I not sleep, I definitely wouldn't be in a deep sleep if it was the night that I knew that I was going to die, if I knew this was my last night on earth. The night that he's going to die, Peter is asleep, like real asleep. And this is the last thing. So the angel comes in, the chains fall off of him, and Peter is able to leave, okay? Now, here's the thing I want for you to take from this. Again, we talked about this already. God wasn't done with Peter. Like, we keep seeing these situations where as Peter's boldness increases, Peter's ability to get out of sticky situations increases. Like, Peter is in front of the Jewish Sanhedrin, who all they would have had to have said was, crucify him, take him out, put him on a cross, and they would have done it. But they didn't. All of a sudden, they're like, well, we can't really do anything. I guess we should let him go, which is what God wanted him to say. And then the same thing here. It's the night that Herod is going to execute him, and an angel shows up and the chains fall off and he just walks out the door like, free pass. Like, peace out, y'all. I'm out of here. I'm out this hizzy. Like, he's gone. Like he got a Monopoly get out of jail free card. Which, if you ask Creed, those things don't really exist. And if they do, they're really expensive. But anyway. You don't get that unless you watch The Office. Very good point. So the point is, again, that God wasn't done with Peter, but he needs for Peter to be a bold witness. He needs for Peter to be a bold witness. And that further motivated and inspired Peter. Like, I've talked about this before. There have been a lot of times where I've wanted to leave the church. There have been times where other people have sent me encouraging text messages or came and gave me strong, powerful words that reminded me that God wasn't through using me here, that God was still continuing to use me. He was using me in ministry. He was using me at First Baptist Rogers. And like, we need that sometimes. Like, we need that reminder. We need that to kind of, but when I get that, like, I get fired up. Like, it makes me realize that I don't want the enemy to win. If I quit, Satan wins. If I say I'm never preaching in church again, or I'm never teaching in Bible study again, if I give up, if I quit, if I leave, Satan wins. And I'm not going to sit here and let everything that God has done in my life and used other people to do in my life stop from being told and let the enemy win. I'm not going to do that. And that's the same thing with Peter. Think about this, guys. I know it kind of sounds silly. I know some of you are like, okay, this is kind of crazy. But put yourself in Peter's shoes for a second. Peter is in jail. Peter is about to be executed. And all of a sudden, an angel shows up. The chains fall off. And he's like, hey, come on, what are you waiting on? Wake up, silly. Let's go. He's like, is this a dream? Like, he's rubbing his eyes. He's like, is this for real? Now, imagine how Peter would feel in that moment. Imagine how Peter would feel in that moment. Pretty powerful. very important to the kingdom of God, that God was using him, that he was a necessary part of the equation. And that's the problem. The reason that some of you don't feel important, the reason that some of you feel like you don't matter, or that God's got his back turned on you, is because you're not putting yourself in a position to be used by God, open to him. Like some of you are very closed off to the idea of God working in your life or hearing what it is that God may want for you to hear. And if you're going to continue to do that, it's going to be hard. But here's the deal. Peter was more useful after he was changed, because Peter had it all wrong. When he walked out of the boat onto the water, he was wrong. He was thinking, this is a cool thing, but he wasn't being faithful because he took his eyes off of Jesus. When Jesus was arrested and he denied Jesus, his thoughts were wrong because he was thinking that Jesus was defeated, that the kingdom wasn't going to prosper, that he wasn't the Messiah. He was thinking all of these negative things. And it wasn't until all of this kind of came together that Peter was like, hey, I'm ready to be a bold witness to him. I'm ready to tell other people what I saw. And when that happened, the Sanhedrin couldn't keep him down. The jail cell couldn't hold him. And eventually it did get to a place where, yes, he was executed and he was killed. But look at what all he had accomplished before that. He wasn't meant to be immortal. He wasn't meant to live forever. His earthly ministry, Billy Graham, was a great preacher, a great minister, but he wasn't intended to live forever. God used him for a time, and his words are still being taught, and his sermons are still being watched and all of that, and that's great. Like, it lives on, but he didn't have to. And it was the same thing with Peter. Peter was like a spark plug. I don't know if y'all know this about spark plugs or not. Spark plugs ignite the fuel that starts the engine, that makes everything kind of fire up, okay? Right. But that's all that they do. They provide the spark, and then they go out. They're not used again for the rest of the time. That's what they're there for. They fire those cylinders up, and that's it. And they go out just like Peter did. Eventually they go out and they're not used anymore. And you have to throw them away and you have to replace them with new ones. And that's the thing. Peter was here for a time to fire that spark, to light that, to get things going. And then it was like he passed it on to somebody else. And it's the same thing with me. I'm only here for a time. And then I'm going to, hopefully, someone will come in behind me. But the thing is, guys, we can't be used until we're ready to change. Like, if you want to continue to hold on to your old ways, if you want to continue to do things your way, if you want to continue to think you know all there is to know about God, then you're going to have a hard time being used because you're not ready to change. You're stuck in your ways, and you want to be the person that you want to be. And you have to be open to realizing that there's more to this world than your limited understanding. I had to come to that realization a long time ago. I feel like I'm a smart guy. I'm a very smart person, but I don't know it all. And I can't begin to pretend like I know it all. And I would encourage you guys to be thinking about that. As you're looking at yourself and those ways you need to change, realize that there's always more that you could be doing. And you have to be open into letting the Lord work in you in those ways. All right, let's pray. Father, just thank you for tonight and for your word. Just thank you for your son, and just for inspiring us and firing us up with boldness. And just we just praise you and we thank you. Just continue to work in our lives. And if these young people are lost or confused and they have questions, I wish that they would ask. But we just give this all to you. It's the name of your son, Jesus, and in your spirit we pray and we ask these things. Amen.